Business is a lot like the movies. As Roxy says in Chicago, you've got to razzle-dazzle them. You've got to make a song and dance about your product. Guests here at Brussels' historic Metropole Hotel have dazzled with their brilliance since the Industrial Revolution, but to really make it big, they took their trade to America. Monica Bellucci's enigmatic beauty translated into big-time dollars when she went to Hollywood. And what would we really know about Albert Einstein if he hadn't adopted America and its marketing know-how to boost a relatively strong theory? As the United States and Europe negotiate the Transatlantic Trade and Investment Partnership, what progress has been made after 8 rounds, and what are the pitfalls still ahead? Is Malmstrom's new trade team any better than Gucht's? And if TTIP was a candidate running for election, what would the campaign playbook look like?
I think a lot of people are understanding that here are negotiations about the daily way of life. How we produce, how we consume, how we want to live in this 21st century. That is on the stake of these TTIP negotiations. So what is my access to cheap energy? What is my access to medicines, etc.? All these issues are linked to the TTIP negotiations.
It would mean more choice and better value for European shoppers. And good news for business.
We've just had the 8th round of the latest TTIP negotiations, and they took place here in Brussels, and they really discussed the sort of structure of the deal. How are they going to continue discussing it? We discussed very tricky areas like market access. We found some movement in reducing tariffs, which was great, but we also need to keep pushing further on other discussions like financial services and also public procurement. Those are really, really key for the EU.
It's not just about tariffs, it's much more than that. It's about a new way of doing trade. It has a strategic dimension between two big partners like the European Union and the United States that share a big economic power but also share values.
We could be able, as the two very main important economical blocks in the world, the States and Europe, put the standard in the world on production, on environment. If that would be the case, I would very much be in favor. But if it means that we lower everything we have just to make sure that we can trade amongst each other, it's not worthwhile.
This is about making sure that we contain threats from Russia. This is about making sure we can compete against China. Either we do this deal with our friends, or other people go and set the rules of the game globally.
When we have a globalized economy, economic questions are political and geopolitical questions. And of course, the United States and the European Union are trying to keep the leading role they have in world economy. Vice versa, the rising economies from China, India, African countries, or even ASEAN and South Korea, who are today big players in the world economy.
I think we all have a responsibility. The right, the left, the business, the trade unions, we all have this responsibility to make this a success. Because if we blow this, I am afraid this could be a major step into European global insignificance.
You know, what does Putin want out of TTIP? He wants Europe to be divided. He wants TTIP to fail. So we need to think about what is our enemy hoping we do, and then how do we try and achieve the opposite?
Certainly it's in all our interests that TTIP succeeds, and I mean not just for Europe, but also ultimately for proper trade relations between Russia and Europe. Obviously we have difficulties at the moment, and those difficulties are not just there for Europe, they're also there for the United States of America. So I think lifting the bar, bringing down those trade barriers, making it easier to trade for two substantial blocs like Europe and the United States is ultimately in Russia's long-term interest as well.
So if we can't agree in the next couple of years with our friends how to set the standards and the rules that will dominate global trade for the next couple of decades, then we're basically handing global leadership over to countries like China. And so we need to be aware of that if we're delaying the TTIP process.
Do political leaders in Europe understand that?
I think some of them do. And some of the ones that do aren't very good at communicating it.
For all you might think of Bush in government, he won 2 terms because of an emotional communication style. Gore lost, essentially because of a wooden, flat campaigning style. He was perfectly reasonable and had the best ideas, but he didn't communicate well. With TTIP, the US and the EU are campaigning like Al Gore.
Is Malmstrom any better at communicating with this commission than the previous commission was?
I would say she is more polite, she is more informative, she is ready to answer questions, she tries to explain what she is doing. If it finally helps to take out the criticisms in these negotiations, that is thing still to be proved.
We've definitely seen an improvement in communication tactics. More effort is going into it, but I think there needs to be a real sense of leadership and people communicating from the top here. This isn't a communications process that should be led by technocrats and negotiators, and that's the situation that we've landed ourselves in at the moment.
Trade negotiators are not a PR firm, and they need their attention and their expertise for the non-sexy technical stuff that trade negotiations really are. I mean, I've seen some of these documents. It is about, you know, if freight is broken, who's responsible? How do customs procedures work? In what language should information be available? It is not always very sexy, but the devil is in the details, so experts are needed.
ISDS, the investor-to-state dispute settlement, is probably the most contentious element of TTIP. But is it really such a dangerous monster lurking in the shadows, ready to undermine democracy?
I think ISDS is a red herring, if I'm really honest with you. I think it's a great fishing tactic for NGOs because it sounds scary, it's confusing, you can say whatever you want because there's no actual text on the table, and you can whip up a lot of fear.
Are the Americans running out of patience with Europe when it comes to things like ISDS?
I think that they're very much aware of the public resistance and questions about this indeed outdated mechanism. I mean, across the political spectrum, citizens and businesses agree that it doesn't function the way it should.
The communication strategy really is a failure. You need to be transparent. You need to explain to the public why you are making all these negotiations with the United States and what do you want to achieve.
If TTIP is eventually ratified, it will be in a more democratic, more inclusive, more transparent form than could possibly have been imagined at the start of negotiations. Though many political groups have opposed elements of TTIP, it has been the left that has shifted the agenda most. The impact of TTIP critics has been to decisively unveil many of the negotiating documents. In a permanent democratic shift, transparency has been increased, though many still argue the process is not transparent enough.
We could and should have probably released and published the negotiating mandate of these negotiations, but the mandate was given to us by member states, and even if the Commission was advocating for its publication, the final word is stands with the governments of the European Union. But what we are trying to do is to make these negotiations the most transparent ever.
Of course, public opinion matters. This Parliament will vote at the end of the day on a TTIP treaty text. And I think we should be focusing now on making it a good TTIP. We're still in the middle of it. We can push the negotiators and the Americans in the right direction where needed, but we should be focused on getting a good TTIP for Europeans.
Does the final agreement have to be approved by all the member states individually? Can one member state block it?
If it's a mixed agreement, then it will have to go through the ratification of all the national parliaments. And what the Commission has been saying, our assessment is that if TTIP is as ambitious and as comprehensive as we want it to be, then most likely it will be submitted also to the ratification of the national parliaments.
So in theory, one European government could block TTIP?
Well, we will be aware of all these sensitivities along the process.
It looks as if the TTIP communication strategy is to deal with the public as though in a polite debating chamber. TTIP opponents have run their communications campaign as though campaigning for an election candidate with a clear focus and sharp message. So what would a TTIP candidate look and sound like?
That's a tough one. TTIP is like the mega candidate. It's the Hillary Clinton of that election race, where you almost don't know where to begin, and it comes with a lot of baggage as well. So you've got to own what is good about it. You can't go and please everybody. TTIP is never going to get 100% support, but you have to engage people so they feel like turning out to vote.
This is about job creation. This is about real growth for Europe. This is about us regaining our place on that global stage. In that global marketplace, we are competitive as the EU, and that's what we need to prove to the rest of the world right now. And going forward with a deal like TTIP is absolutely going to deliver that, and it's going to change people's lives.
People need to know what we're trying to negotiate. We're not trying to diminish European standards. If anything, we're trying to ensure that what we have we hold, and that these really important regulatory standards that are in place are replicated in the United States and elsewhere.
If we look at the critiques towards TTIP, a lot of it is critiques towards globalization as such. And we have to understand that globalization, whatever we do, whether we are successful with TTIP or not, will continue to happen. And this is the opportunity we've got to shape it according to our values, according to Western values.
There needs to be less defensiveness and there needs to be more humanity in the discussion about TTIP. So I think TTIP negotiators and people in the Commission, for example, they should be taking TTIP on the road. They should be talking to people at a local and grassroots level. They should not be afraid to hit back at people who are making up misinformation. They should use normal language.
If TTIP fails, why will it fail?
If TTIP fails, TTIP cannot fail. That is absolutely not going to happen. TTIP cannot fail. This is a one window of opportunity that we have. They don't come along very often. And this will create the largest deal we've ever seen and the greatest trading area in the world.
Psychologist and Democrat political strategist Drew Weston said, "In politics, when reason and emotion collide, emotion invariably wins." Today, transatlantic trade is flourishing. But like Stephen Hawking's view of the universe, it should keep expanding. And if it doesn't, our economies will collapse in on themselves. TTIP is a 21st century bid to avoid an economic and geopolitical black hole.